Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mind Your Mission, a podcast for women looking for wisdom and encouragement in embracing our God-given purpose and staying on course towards what he says is good in his word. I'm Erin, and my co-host Liz and I are really excited to dive into today's episode.
Yeah, this week, Erin's son turned 1. So I've never heard our birth story actually in detail. We texted about it after it happened, but since we didn't live in the same area, we just never really got the chance to catch up about it. So I'm so excited to dive into it today because I always ask every mom I meet about their birth stories because I'm just so interested in it and I want to educate myself for when the time comes for me. And it's crazy all the different variations that you hear and just how much God is in control and you are not. And so I'm really excited to just hear about Erin's story because it is kind of crazy. I'm sure everyone's birth story has some sort of aspect of that to it, but I think hers is really interesting and I have a lot to learn from it. So I'm super excited to get into it today.
Yeah, we're kind of getting real and vulnerable from the very start of this podcast, but I was talking with a mom group that I have. We do a little Zoom chat every month, and we were just sharing each other's birth stories, and a lot of us had heard each other's stories before, but every time I tell it and every time I hear somebody else's, I feel like a new piece of God's character is revealed in it. And one of my friends mentioned that this is one of the biggest moments in our lives. The reason people tell their birth stories is because it's one of the defining moments of their lives. And that's definitely true for me. Motherhood this past year has totally shaped me. So I'm excited to tell you the beginning of that story today. So I wanted to start by sharing some of the things that I had on my birth plan, my birth preferences, if you will. And it's definitely important, and I knew it was important not to hold on to these things too tightly because you never know what's going to happen. And as you'll hear, a lot of these things didn't even come to fruition. But it does help to have a plan and to discuss your expectations, specifically with your husband, so that they know how to best support you. And then also with your doctor and care team so that they know your desires and your choices. In today's world, informed consent often requires active effort on the part of the patient, unfortunately. And doctors, while they're very well-intentioned, most of them, I hope, they might not always provide a comprehensive breakdown of the pros and cons of various medical options. And in some cases, they might not even know all of the information themselves. So that means it's up to you to take responsibility for researching and understanding the care options that align with your preferences and your values. Being proactive and seeking out information is key to making informed decisions about your health and the health of your family. So one thing I knew for sure after I had done a lot of research was that I wanted to aim for an unmedicated birth. I wasn't against an epidural, but I wanted to avoid interventions unless they were necessary, as one intervention can sometimes lead to needing more intervention. So for example, if you go in and get induced, the odds just statistically of you needing to have your water broken or needing to up the Pitocin or needing potentially a C-section are higher if you start with intervention from the get-go. So to prepare for labor and delivery, my husband and I took a hypnobirthing course with a friend of mine from high school who was working on her certification. So she asked if she could teach it to us for free. And I'm glad that we did it, but I'm not sure that I would do it again. I didn't know anything really about the birth process before the course, but since then, after going through it and doing more research, I think that I'll probably go a different route.
What exactly is hypnobirthing? Because I've never really heard that term before, probably because I'm not in the motherhood realm yet.
Yeah, hypnobirthing is a childbirth preparation method that emphasizes meditation, relaxation techniques, and positive affirmations to help reduce fear, pain, and stress during labor. And so for me, tangibly, this looked like listening to an affirmation track each night before bed in the weeks leading up to labor and practicing visualization techniques to keep my mind focused on something other than the pain. And it also talks about not using the word pain in general. Like instead of pain, you should use the word pressure, things like that. And there are several positive aspects to hypnobirthing. It's built on the belief that childbirth is a natural, normal process that women's bodies are beautifully designed for. It also suggests that fear creates tension, which can heighten pain, and that by embracing mental and physical relaxation, we can mitigate that tension and discomfort. And in many ways, both of those things are very true. when people, especially my Christian friends, would ask about hypnobirthing, I felt compelled to clarify that it wasn't what it sounded like. And that need to justify should have probably been a yellow flag for me, honestly. The term hypnobirthing often makes you think of hypnosis. I mean, hypno in the word, which hypnosis can sound very new age, which it is. So when friends asked, I would quickly explain that I was taking a more Christian approach to hypnobirthing rather than a mystical one. And looking back, I realized that next time I want to lean more fully on God's word and meditate on his truths, because at its core, hypnobirthing is about empowerment. It's about the idea that women can take control of their birthing experiences. However, as believers, we have to recognize that while, yes, God did design us as women to bear children, this experience, like all things in life, must be viewed in light of the fall. Jesus himself in John 16:33 says, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." The reality is that childbirth, like every other part in life, is touched by sin and brokenness. And Genesis 3 clearly states that pain in childbirth will be very severe as a consequence of sin. Yes, childbirth is a miraculous process and women are uniquely created for it, but the pain is real and it's purposeful. The part of hypnobirthing that aligns most with truth is its focus on releasing fear. God's word consistently tells us not to fear, even in the midst of hardship. Isaiah 41:10 says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." God doesn't promise an absence of pain or difficulty, but he promises his presence and his strength in the midst of it. And a verse that's often misquoted is Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." This verse doesn't mean we can have a pain-free birth if we just believe hard enough. Rather, I think it follows Paul's reflections on enduring hardships. If you put this verse in context, it comes after Paul's talking about the hard things that he's had to walk through. And his confidence that it's Christ who gives him strength to persevere through the difficult circumstance. It's not about avoiding pain, but finding strength in God through it. So next time that I'm pregnant or in labor, I want to meditate on the truth of God's word rather than relying on silly affirmations that might not be grounded in truth. A lot of them might be true before birth. Like one of them I think was like, my body and my baby are prepared for birth. Like, yeah, I'm prepared for birth. Like, all that's true. But he has given me hope that goes beyond circumstances. So even when the things in those affirmation tracks don't become true, God has truth that persists through all of that. So next time I'm going to choose to speak scripture, verses that remind me that God is with me in the pain and that he has given me hope even in the hardest moments. Childbirth offers a really beautiful opportunity for us to reflect on the parallel of a woman's pain and labor and the pain that Jesus endured to bring life to the world. His sacrifice through great suffering brought forth life for all of us. Similarly, a woman's labor pain produces life. It's a powerful image, and while going through labor, it's such a chance to be filled with gratitude for Christ's ultimate sacrifice for us. So anyway, I will link a really good podcast below that discusses the pain-free birth movement, as they call it, and some of the nuance that exists when it comes to that topic. I'll link this so that you'll have more insight when making the decision of how you want to prepare for labor.
I'll definitely have to check out that podcast when my time comes. And I feel like a lot of this new age stuff that's been emerging, like meditation and stuff like that, it's always kind of like
half true.
It's like a half true. So it's important to like know the word and know what God says. Like he will have pain during labor. That's part of the fall. So knowing that can really help you with insight when it comes to determining if something that sounds kind of new age like is of God or not. But there are so many decisions I feel like you have to make when you are preparing for a baby. And I want to be informed whenever it happens for me, but also be grounded in God's truth, as you mentioned. And my goal for those decisions is to be a reflection of his peace and not stress, and to help me honor him in the process. So what are some of your other birth preferences that you had? And how did you determine these preferences? Like, what research did you do? Because there's so much out there. It is so overwhelming. And I just want to know how you found your resources and determine your preferences and like what led you to desire a natural birth.
Yeah, so to start, I would say for all of pregnancy, for my whole experience with motherhood so far, we sometimes overcomplicate it by going to the internet first. The internet has every answer that you could be looking for. Algorithms, even on Google these days, are going to be geared toward something that you're specifically looking for. So to start, before you go to the internet, try going to your mother. Try going to your friend at church. Try going to your sister. Like, I think we've gotten away from just the community aspect of motherhood, which back in the day was such a huge thing that women relied on. And so start there is what I'd say. I started off good at that, but then eventually, like, as baby was born, then I started turning to my phone first, because when you're looking for information at that point, it's in the middle of the night. But still, like, I would say go to the women in your real community first. And then as far as, like, I don't know, natural birth, the decision to pursue that, I think for some women, unfortunately, and I try to stay away from this, is rooted in a little bit of pride and that empowerment piece that we were just talking about. Like, they want to have a natural birth so that they can say they birthed naturally and they experienced it, and they pushed through the pain and all that. For me, I think part of it was just wanting to simplify and to not make a natural process a medical one. Like, yes, we birth in hospitals these days, but it's not necessarily a medical procedure by any means. I mentioned earlier that the pain in labor is purposeful, and it's like the pain after you work out. Like, it's a pain that's supposed to be there, so it's not necessarily something that needs intervention. So I wanted to treat it as such, as a normal process that God created us to go through. And I also think, like I was just talking about, I almost in a sense wanted to purposely put myself in that vulnerable space where, like, I had to rely on God's strength. I don't know that we experience that enough in our day-to-day in America. We just, like, even if we are living below the poverty line, like, we just don't have the same kind of hardships that put us in that desperation anymore. Everything is so convenient for us. So there's part of it that was that. And then as far as research specifically goes, I think I got my research sources from those friends that I was talking about. I have a lot of friends who are nurses, a lot of friends who have given birth recently and chose the natural route. And so they had done a lot of research. A lot of my friends are just so passionate about making informed decisions. And that goes with everything beyond pregnancy and birth too. Like, when it comes to choosing food for their family, they're so for being informed. So that was kind of the basis of how I made my decision. So some of my other birth preferences, I wanted my husband and my sister, who is currently in nursing school, to be in the room with me. My husband and I created our birth plan together, and so he would be there to communicate to the doctors if I wasn't able to, if I was going through contractions or something. And then my sister, acting as a doula of sorts, was there to provide just that emotional and physical support through the process. Like, my sister knows me well. Like, she's gone with me through, like, I don't know, hard swim meets and things like that where I physically want to push myself. And so she knew, like, she was a better person to gauge whether I needed to be pushed or if I needed, positive affirmation, stuff like that. Another thing, I wanted to have intermittent monitoring, which means that you don't have a monitor wrapped around you to constantly check. And the reason for that was because I wanted to be able to freely move around the room and to get in different positions. My husband and I were waiting to find out the gender of the baby. That decision was just because my husband is a very traditionalist, I'd say, and his mom, with all 5 of her kids, waited to find out the gender, and he just wanted to have that surprise. It's one thing he says that we don't just get to know, that we can wait to know. So he was kind of passionate about that. I've, like, asked him about baby number 2. I'm like, can we find out the gender before? And he's like, no, we should wait. And I'm like, hey, like, I just want to know. But I'm just, like, a type A planning person, and so, like, that's why I want to know. So anyway, I wanted him to announce it when baby came out. Another thing, I was really hoping to go into labor naturally instead of being induced. And of course, looking back, I'm laughing because none of these things actually came to fruition, but they were still helpful in guiding conversations with my doctor and husband. So still recommend having a plan for sure.
Yeah, I still feel like it's good to know that stuff going in so that you're prepared when they offer up different things, whether you want it or not. But how are the days leading up to your due date? Because I know you were a little bit late. So I want to know how that was for you and how you relied on God's strength and everything through that.
Yeah. So my due date was the first week of January, and I knew that due dates weren't always exact, especially for first pregnancies, which often go past the estimated date. But around 38 weeks, my doctor had recommended scheduling an induction in the case that I did go late to ensure that I would have a spot available at the hospital, which I have mixed feelings about because you should not make any medical decision just for convenience, just for a spot at the hospital. Like, they'll make a spot for you if you're going into labor if you need a spot. But ultimately, I agreed to schedule the induction for when I'd be 41 weeks and 4 days, not really expecting to make it that far. And that was further than my doctor would have liked. And so by the time I reached that point, so a week and a half over my due date, I didn't really have the courage at that point to ask to push it further. And plus, I'm not a doctor, and so I'm not an expert on these things. So ultimately, I felt like scheduling the induction was the right choice for me and my baby. And it's just such a delicate balance between trusting your doctor's guidance because they do know a lot. They are experts in their fields. And it's just a balance between that and advocating for a more natural approach. But before induction day, I had tried several natural methods to encourage labor: walking, curb walking, eating dates, drinking raspberry leaf tea. I tried a membrane sweep, which is when your doctor, I don't know if you know, it's when they go in with their finger, a gloved finger, into the cervix, and they sweep their finger around the membranes of the amniotic sac, and the separation of the sac from the uterus is supposed to simulate the release of prostaglandins, which can help soften the cervix and trigger contractions. So when my doctor attempted this sweep, I wasn't dilated at all or effaced, so she couldn't actually complete the sweep. To go into labor, your cervix must be dilated, which means open, and it has to be effaced, which means thinned out. This allows baby to move through the birth canal during delivery. So it was a bit discouraging to realize that I was likely going to make it to the scheduled induction. I knew that every pregnancy is different and that it's common to go past the due date, but this was the moment that I really internalized that I might not go into labor naturally like I had hoped. I didn't dwell on it too much, but there was definitely a slight feeling that there was something wrong with my body, that it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. And looking back, I know that I can't control everything, but there are definitely things that I would do differently in future pregnancies to help my body better prepare. For most of my pregnancy, nausea kicked my butt, and I never got back into a workout routine after the first trimester. I also definitely could have cooked healthier meals because I was nauseous. I just didn't feel like cooking, and I ate like trash. I also could have done like more stretching. And all of motherhood, as I'm learning, is just a process of figuring out the difference between mom guilt, which is feeling responsible for things you can't control, the difference between that and true conviction, which is something that we should pay attention to and use to motivate us to make changes and be better in the future. So when it comes to like going over my due date, like that wasn't in my control, but there are things that I could have done like earlier on to help prepare better and encourage that process. So anyway, I was sad about the induction because I had really hoped to labor at home. I had envisioned being able to sleep in my own bed, to take a shower, to eat snacks, because once you go into the hospital, like you can't eat. So while that wasn't a huge source of regret, it was definitely something that I mourned a little. And it's an experience that I really hope to have in the future. I'm not sure that I would ever choose a home birth, but there are so many aspects of it that just make sense to me. And it was a strange mental shift to know exactly when I was having the baby. But for someone like me, a type A planner, I guess it had its perks. It gave us the chance to make sure everything was in place, that the house was cleaned before we went. And so while the situation wasn't ideal, there were definitely okay things about it. Like there was a silver lining. And the night before the induction, I wasn't anxious to the point of being able to sleep. It was more of an excited nervousness. Like, I don't know, Liz, you've probably experienced like the feeling before a big race when you've prepared for what's ahead. You know it's going to be tough, but you're eager to take on the challenge.
No, that's funny that you mentioned that, because a year ago as well, I ran the Houston Marathon, and what you're talking about, there's a lot of parallels. I remember like I couldn't sleep the night before. I was excited, but also terrified because I knew you're like willingly putting yourself through pain.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it was all worth it in the end. But I think your story is also such a reminder that God is in control. We can do everything by the book in hopes that the things will work out the way we want them to. But the truth is, it's all in God's hands. And I'm feeling that right now, because if you can't hear me, I'm kind of sick right now. Mm-hmm. And I have a surgery scheduled for next week, and I really didn't want to get sick. So I was doing everything I could to prevent it. Got all the supplements, got everything, but because my husband was sick, and I still got sick. So no matter how hard I tried to control it, I still got sick. And it's kind of similar to what Erin is talking about. And as someone who's never given birth, everything you're talking about is like very daunting to me. And I'm learning a lot of terms. And the thought of not being in control sounds scary to me, because I also like to control things and know what's going to happen. But I think God uses experiences like this to remind us that he's on the throne. And I'm curious about how on induction day, how did you approach sticking to your preferences? Like, were you able to find ways that made your experience more aligned than what you had hoped for?
Yeah, on induction day, even though I knew that I was getting induced, I wanted to stick to my preferences as much as possible. So when we arrived at the hospital, I gave the nurses a copy of my birth plan, and they were incredibly kind and accommodating. My doctor, unfortunately, was the one who was a bit more hesitant about my requests, but the nurses helped advocate for me, which I really appreciated. I feel like the medical world does get demonized online by the natural health world, but there are some good nurses, some good doctors out there. You just have to find them. So they put me on the lowest amount of Pitocin possible and used a Foley bulb catheter, which I'll explain what those are. So Pitocin is a synthetic version of oxytocin, a hormone that plays a key role in stimulating uterine contractions during labor. And then a Foley bulb catheter is a flexible tube with two small balloons on the end, and they put the catheter up into your cervix, and then the balloons are inflated with either water or a sterile saline. And they apply gentle pressure to encourage the cervix to soften and dilate, which, like we mentioned, is needed to go into labor and to get the baby out. So the goal is for those two things to trigger your natural contractions. The hope is that if you're over your due date, then your body should be pretty much ready. It might just need a little bit of encouragement. So by triggering those natural contractions after induction, it helps move you along. And then once you are 5 centimeters, the catheter should slide out and you should be good to go on your own. Your body should kind of kick into gear. So I was a bit nervous about needing Pitocin, since I've heard that it can make contractions more intense, but since I've never experienced contractions without Pitocin, I'm not sure if it was worse or not. I did have like the lowest dose of Pitocin ever, so like hopefully it didn't make him that bad. And then the catheter made me uneasy too, because like who wouldn't want a tube inserted and inflated inside them? But all things considered, it actually wasn't as bad as I had imagined it. It really didn't hurt that bad. So my contractions started almost immediately after the induction began, and I progressed to 5 centimeters faster than I anticipated. The Foley bulb caught me off guard. It fell out while I was using the bathroom much sooner than I had expected to reach 5 centimeters. So I thought that it had just like come out on accident, like they had put it in wrong. But no, I was at 5 centimeters within like an hour or two. And at this point, we just settled in. We played card games, listened to music, and just relaxed. Like the contractions were going, but they really weren't that bad at that point. They just felt like strong period cramps. And the way I would explain them would be like manageable waves. They had a clear start, a peak, and an end. So like they would come in, they'd build up, feel really period crampy, like intense period crampy. and then they would go away and then you'd have a break. So people had told me it was going to be like a wave, but it's really like a wave, like definitive start and end. Once the catheter came out, I felt a sense of relief because there wasn't that pressure there anymore, but I did want the contractions to keep building in intensity so that I could avoid needing additional interventions. A little while after the catheter came out, my doctor suggested breaking my water to help things progress, and I did hesitate at first because it felt like she was recommending this more for convenience than necessity, so I pushed back and asked her to give it more time. So she did, about an hour or two, and then she returned to do it when my contractions had slowed down. And I was nervous that breaking my water would hurt, but honestly, it was surprisingly okay. In fact, it felt kind of good, which is really weird, but just how it was. The best way I could describe it is just like a slow gush of warm liquid just coming out. And so in a sense, it was like kind of nice, but anyway, that's weird. After my water was broken, things picked up quickly and I had to really focus and breathe through each contraction. Before that, I'd just been able to distract myself with games or whatever, but now I had to really focus and breathe. And at one point, the nurse checked me and I was at 7 centimeters. So I had made some progress since the catheter came out when I was at 5. And at this point, my husband and my sister took turns like counting me through contractions. I switched positions every 30 minutes and just was focused on breathing and staying as relaxed as I could, one contraction at a time. And as time went on, I definitely started to feel more and more exhausted. My mindset was still strong, but my body was just getting drained. It felt like jet lag. I don't know if you've experienced like extreme jet lag when your brain says like, stay awake, but you can barely keep your eyes open. It kind of felt like that. And it was intimidating because I knew that there was still a long ways to go. And that's when I really had to start leaning on prayer and asking for the Lord's strength. And at some point after this, the atmosphere in the room transitioned, I'd say, from a sense of calm positivity to a more serious tone. And I use the word transition because although I wasn't as far along as transition is usually indicated, I think that this marked the transition stage of labor for me. The transition stage of labor is the final part of the first stage just before you start pushing. So during this time, the contractions become stronger, longer, and closer together. So they'll come in and they'll go away, but then you don't really have a break before the next one starts. And it's also when a lot of women experience the feelings of doubt or fear. And for me, this was when I started to feel more overwhelmed and discouraged. And I remember thinking like, either I'm close to pushing, like either this is transition and I'm going to be close, or I need an epidural. And the hardest part about labor is just not knowing how much longer you have to go. Like in a marathon, at least you know, like 26.2, like you know the mileage. And here, it's tough to mentally push through when you don't know how much more you have to endure. So when it came to deciding about the epidural, spoiler, I didn't end up getting the epidural, but this was probably the most emotionally challenging point of the whole experience. And it wasn't because I felt like I was failing or because of any of that, but it was more so the pressure of managing everyone's expectations in the room. My husband and my sister knew that I wanted them to push me, but I didn't really know how to communicate when I reached the point of not wanting to be pushed anymore. Plus, like, I knew that I would get to that point of needing the epidural, like a lot of women do. And I knew that I wanted to choose to push past that and that I could do it. But the mental is just so challenging. And I just didn't want to lash out or make anyone else, my husband or my sister, feel unappreciated. And so that was just a really tough balance for me to navigate. So eventually a nurse came in, and it was a new nurse because shift change had just happened at 7 p.m. And they checked me at this point after I had had a few hours of intense contractions that were really close together. And when she checked me, I was still at 7 centimeters. And so since I hadn't progressed at all in those hours, I was really defeated and chose that I wanted to get the epidural. So the nurse left to get the anesthesiologist, and I went to the bathroom. And all day I had been using wireless monitoring but sometimes those wireless monitors would start picking up on my heart rate instead of the baby's heart rate. And so they had to come in and readjust it. And when I came back from the bathroom, this same thing appeared to be happening. And so I sat on the edge of the bed, which is where I would need to be for the epidural. And the nurse tried to adjust the monitors. And I didn't think anything of it because it had been happening all day. And I was just trying to focus on my contractions. Like, they were still really intense at this point. The thing was that the monitor was picking up a heart rate of 50 beats per minute. And since I had just been up and moving around going to the bathroom, my heart rate was higher than 50. And so this meant that it was probably actually picking up on baby's heart rate, which all day had been up around 130. Like, that's how high a baby's heart rate should be. So the nurse, I didn't pick up on any of this. The nurse was taking a while, and she had me lay down to try readjusting. And eventually another nurse came in, and this is when I did start to understand that something was going on. I overheard her, the new nurse, ask my nurse the question, "Is this real?" And that's when I started wondering, like, why would you be asking, "Is this real?" if something isn't wrong? And so at that point, it was clear in my mind that the nurse had hit some sort of panic button to get more nurses in the room, because within seconds, the room was filled with other nurses. The anesthesiologist had shown up. And at that point, my eyes were closed for a lot of this because of how bad the contractions hurt. And I knew that all I could do in this moment to help the situation was breathe and try to stay as calm as possible. They had given me an oxygen mask so that I could just breathe easier after this, but I could barely hear over the sound of the air, so everything was just chaos. And so they were moving me from side to side, seeing if I was maybe laying on baby's cord. They had me on all fours at one point, and then they eventually stuck an internal monitor inside me and put it on baby's head so that they could get a more accurate read on his heart rate to see if it had really dropped. And my husband and sister, they did a great job through this, reassuring me that everything was okay and that the doctors knew what they were doing, telling me to just breathe and relax. And after a few minutes of not seeing baby's heart rate increase, my doctor made the call to do an emergency C-section. So within like 2 minutes, I would say, things went from like totally okay, like, okay, yeah, I'm tapping out, getting the induction, but like, we're going to get through this, like, to all of a sudden, like, something is very wrong. And like, it was a crazy shift, like, just to have that many doctors, that many nurses in your room, for them to be moving so fast and for them to be panicked. That's like something that you can sense when a doctor's panicked. And that is what really like sets you off, because like, they're the ones who are supposed to be in control and calm and know what's going on. Like, when they're panicked, like, that's not a good sign. So, you know, at this moment, I had no idea what was happening. Like, all this is happening so fast, and I'm just in so much pain. And the only way that I can describe how I felt was complete, total surrender. A kind of surrender that I have never experienced before. And I don't want to say that I didn't care, because I absolutely cared about both my baby's well-being and my own. Like, I totally cared about the outcome, but I also had this deeper sense that no matter what, things would somehow be okay. And it was terrifying, because in that moment, nothing was guaranteed. There were 4 possible outcomes. Either we're both okay, we're both not okay, I'm okay and the baby's not, or the baby's okay and I'm not. Like, I didn't know what was going to happen, but I did know that even if one of us wasn't okay, that things would still be okay. And that's such a hard feeling to explain if you don't know Jesus or haven't experienced the peace that comes from knowing that he has a plan for your life. And I don't want to over-spiritualize things. That's like something I really want to stay away from. But one thing that became so clear to me in that state of surrender was just how deeply grateful I am for the sacrifice that God made in giving his son. Like, at that moment, physically speaking, I had no idea if my son was going to be okay or if I was going to be okay. I had to confront the what ifs. And that's a scary place to be, but also a place where you have to really confront whether or not you trust that God's plan is better than the one that you have. And that state only lasted a few minutes, but my mind did also go to the story of Abraham offering Isaac on the altar. Abraham trusted God so deeply that even when things didn't make sense in his mind, he believed that what God asks of us is good. And when God says, do not fear, he's speaking truth. That's a peace that only comes from knowing God's plan is bigger than anything that we can see or understand in the moment. So as they were frantically like pulling the cords out of the wall, trying to get me into the operating room as quickly as possible, the chaos in the room was just crazy. Like, again, I wish my doctors like maintained a level of calm, but they didn't. And I thankfully felt this overwhelming sense of peace throughout that again is only available through Christ. But at this point, I thought that I was going to be put under general anesthesia because in order to do the C-section that quickly, they wouldn't have had time to do the usual spinal tap, which you're awake for. And so I was preparing myself to just drift off to sleep and to wake up later and find out what had happened then. But again, God's plan is greater than even the doctor's plan. And so when they wheeled me into the OR, they went to insert the catheter, which is needed for surgery. But when they checked, I was already 10 centimeters and ready to push. So in the span of just moving from my room to the operating room, I'd gone from 7 centimeters dilated to 10 centimeters dilated, and my baby was crowning. So like his head was ready to come out. So I was like completely frazzled because I had gone from like mentally thinking I was going to just be knocked out to suddenly like needing to push this baby out right now. And so the room was like so loud with people yelling at me to push. And I managed like one push. And then after that, like one of the doctors like took control of the room. She locked eyes with me and said, okay, you're going to take a breath and then you're going to push with your next contraction, because pushing against a contraction is just not very helpful. You're going to push with your next contraction and you're going to get this baby out. You're going to get your baby out. And so I was so thankful that she like calmed me down, got me in that right mental state, because the next push, like with my contraction, I pushed and he was out. And so in just 2 contractions and 2 pushes, one frazzled push and one focused push, he was born. And it was incredibly painful. I tore a lot. I had like she called it a 3.5 degree tear, which the worst is a 4-degree tear. My husband hadn't even made it to the room at that point because it all happened so fast. And they used a vacuum to help pull him out. Like it's a suction vacuum that they put in onto his head and like pull him out. So it was considered an assisted delivery. But in the end, like he was here and that's all that mattered. They placed him on my chest for a brief moment, but quickly then moved him over to be evaluated. Like I know that they put him on my chest, but I don't really remember that feeling. Like I didn't even see him. Like I was just wasn't there. I didn't know he was a boy. I was like yelling at the doctors, like, tell me what it is. Like, what is it? Like, I want to know. And so, but they took him over to get monitored to make sure that his heart rate had returned to normal and all that. And thankfully, everything checked out fine. And just as quickly as things had escalated, they calmed down again. And I still don't know, like to this day, like why his heart rate dropped like that. I don't know if it was because he was stuck, like he was 9 pounds, 7 ounces. So he was a bigger baby. I don't know if like my body wasn't relaxed enough. Like I have no idea why his heart rate dropped. Like that still to me, like kind of bothers me that I don't know. But ultimately, I think that I was in transition, that if I had just tried pushing, like things would have happened, that I was just like so close that like his heart rate, he was stressed. Like, I don't know, but that is his birth story. And he is now 1 year old and a very healthy boy. He's a little chubby guy. He's been in the 99th percentile, like every single appointment that we've had. So, you know, he's a big boy. But yeah, we love him so much. And that's kind of the birth story.
Your story is so crazy, and all the changes that you had, like you went from this to that. And it's just a reminder that you don't know what's going to happen when you go into the hospital to have your baby. Because I'm thinking about my surgery next week, and it's like, I know I'm getting put under. I know this is happening. Like it is pretty streamlined unless something like majorly goes wrong, which I'm hoping is not the case. But when you go in for birth, you truly don't know, like, am I going to need a C-section, or am I going to be able to do this naturally? Like, you can only educate yourself so much, and the rest of it, you kind of have to put yourself into God's hands. And I think your story is just a reminder of letting him be in control. I'm so happy that your son is just so healthy and so happy, and just I've met him a couple of times and he's just the cutest baby, and he has such a cute personality and he's funny. So it makes me excited to have one as well. You were like one of my first friends. I feel like all my friends kind of got pregnant at the same time. And so seeing all of them have babies has kind of taken away the fear in me of having kids. So I love getting to hear your story.
One thing that's so crazy too is that it is so easy to forget the intensity afterwards. Like, telling the story, like, yes, it was traumatic. Like, I don't want to use that word if it's just hyperbole, but it was traumatic. Like, those 5 minutes were traumatic, but it was short-lived. Looking back, I'm not fearful about a future birth. Like, I thought I would be, like, in those moments, like right after giving birth, I was like, man, I never want to do this again. Like, that was terrifying. Like, oh my goodness. But like, God is so gracious to use children to soften our hearts and to change our minds. Like, like a few days after Weston was born, I'm like, okay, like, maybe I'm ready. I want to do this again. Like, I want more of these, because these are like, children are just such a blessing, and you forget just the pain that happens, and all you remember is the life. And just same with Jesus. Like, we remember his pain on the cross so that we can realize the life that he's given us. So I just don't want anyone to be afraid of labor. Like, the one thing that was good about the hypnobirthing course was just to release that fear. Like, when we fear, then we're going to be tense, and when we're tense, it'll be more painful. So we just have to let go of that fear and just trust the Lord.
Amen to that. And my last question for you is, what is one decision that we can make today to help women mind their mission in childbirth?
I would say decide to take responsibility for educating yourself about what childbirth entails, and decide to start meditating on God's truth now. Whether you're pregnant, you want to be pregnant soon, or you're not even married, like, meditate on God's truth. And one verse that comes to mind is Romans 12:2, where it says, "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So when it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, I think that this is applicable to both of those decisions. In deciding to take responsibility for educating yourselves, you're renewing your mind. You're not letting the world tell you what's good. You're researching things. You're getting fact. You're getting truth. So doing that, renewing your mind with things in the world, is a good way to go. But then also renewing your mind in the Word by getting refreshed by God's living, breathing, and active Word is just so, so important.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's so important to share these stories with other women so that they can go into childbirth educated and less fearful, because even though it seemed like your story was going one way, God redeemed it and you have a healthy son.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like what Liz and I want, what we want our audience to be, is women who are either already mothers or seeking direction and figuring out what the future entails for them. So that's why I'm hoping that this episode can reach the girls who either have experienced labor and can relate to some of this, or who haven't yet and are just looking to hear the experience. I think the Bible tells us to teach and admonish younger women, and so I just want to share the story so it can reach them and encourage them.
Yeah, and we both kind of have both sides of the spectrum. Like, Erin's a mom and I'm not, but I would like to be one day. And so we both kind of have both perspectives. And even if you're single, you can still listen to this podcast. We'll still have some guests that can speak to your situation. And we were both single once too. So definitely keep listening, especially if you desire to be a mother and that's something you want. We want to join you in that and encourage you in that. And thank you so much, all of you who tuned in today. You can find all of our socials linked down below. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And with that, we're Erin and Liz helping you mind your mission.